Republican Vice President Richard Nixon stands at a podium on a soundstage, facing a television camera with microphones visible above his head. His seated opponent, Democratic Senator John F. Kennedy, looks on. Figure 12. One Republican Vice President Richard Nixon and Democratic Senator John F. Kennedy participated in the United States' first televised presidential debate in 1960. Credit: Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy debate in Chicago while being televised by Richard Nixon Library and Birthplace National Archives. Chapter outline. 12. When the media as a political institution, why does it matter? 12. Two types of media and the changing media landscape. 12. 3. How do media and elections interact? 12. 4. The internet and social media. 12. 5. Declining global trust in the media. It was 1960, and Republican Vice President Richard Nixon stood at the podium, appearing drained and sweaty, while his opponent, Democratic Senator John F. Kennedy, JFK, looked as if he had been ready for this moment, the United States' first televised presidential debate, his whole life. When asked which candidate did better, Nixon's running mate, Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge, who had watched the debate on television, said he thought JFK did a better job. In contrast, Senator Lyndon B. Johnson, who was running on the Democratic ticket with JFK, listened to the debate on the radio and deemed Nixon the winner. Did Senator Kennedy's good looks and confidence win the televised debate over a pale, overtired Nixon? Did the fact that the debate was televised change the outcome of the election? While academics have been unable to definitively answer these questions, one thing is sure. Television changed politics that evening in 1960, and as an institution, the media continues to influence how people understand government, candidates, and policies. Video: how JFK's clever TV strategies helped him win the election. John F. Kennedy's presidential campaign took advantage of the popularity and reach of television. Learning outcomes. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain the importance of a free press both in the United States and abroad. Describe how the media acts as a watchdog and give examples. Understand and define how political information is mediated. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The First Amendment to the United States Constitution. The press is the only profession explicitly protected in the United States Constitution. Many attribute this protection to James Madison and his writings in the Federalist Papers, but the idea of a free press stretches back to well before Madison wrote out his ideas on what constitutes a perfect democracy. The origins of the free press in the United States can be traced back to Cotto's Letters, a collection of essays written in the 1720s by two British writers, John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon. Using the pseudonym Cotto, they published their articles in the British press, criticizing the British monarchy for its corruption and tyrannical practices. Decades later, American colonists felt the effects of these letters during their own struggles against the Crown one, and in 1776, Virginia became the first state to formally adopt a constitutional provision to protect press freedom. 2. Why is the idea of protecting the press so embedded in the United States concept of government, and why is this concept so important? Do other nations protect the media to the same extent or even more? The next section will examine these questions. The Fourth Estate and freedom of the press. The importance of a free press can be boiled down to a sentence from esteemed University of Illinois at Chicago lecturer Doris Graeber's seminal work, Mass Media and American Politics. The mass media serve as powerful guardians of political norms because the American people believe that a free press should keep them informed about the wrongdoings of government. 3. Another common way of defining the media's role is to say that it acts as the fourth estate, or the unofficial fourth branch of government that checks the others. The term fourth estate is credited to Scottish writer Thomas Carlyle, who wrote, "Burke said there were 3 estates in Parliament, but in the reporter's gallery yonder there sat a fourth estate more important far than they all." 4. In other words, people look to the media, the fourth estate, to keep the government in check. The role of the media must be protected if it is to carry out that task. Throughout U.S. history, the media has fulfilled this role as intended. In the late 1960s, Rand Corporation analyst Daniel Ellsberg provided classified documents to the New York Times and the Washington Post, proving that the government was concealing protracted military involvement in the Vietnam War. The New York Times withstood government pressure and a Supreme Court case to go on to publish a series of articles now known as the Pentagon Papers, which revealed the extent to which the American public had been lied to about the country's progress in that war. The Watergate scandal is perhaps the most famous example of press freedom and the role of the press as watchdog, another term for the Fourth Estate. In this instance, a government informant known as Deep Throat fed Washington Post reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein confidential information about then-President Richard Nixon's corrupt campaign practices. An ensuing series of investigative pieces by the two journalists revealed multiple abuses of power in Nixon's re-election campaign, and their reporting ultimately led to the indictment of multiple presidential aides and the eventual resignation of the president himself. Video. Watergate. In this video clip, investigative journalists Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, editor Barry Sussman, and former executive editor Ben Bradlee recall how, when they worked for the Washington Post in 1972, they broke the story of the Watergate scandal, a story that started with an investigation of a break-in at a Washington, D.C. hotel and led to a constitutional crisis, the resignation of President Richard Nixon, and almost 50 criminal convictions. In the case of the Pentagon Papers, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that the president's argument, that prior Restraint 5 was necessary in order to protect national security, was not enough to abrogate the fundamental law embodied in the First Amendment. 6, and this is the most important First Amendment case, because it addresses the sweeping right of the press and press protections in the 20th century. Watergate showed how a protected press is free to serve one of its main purposes, which is to reveal government misconduct. New Yorker staff writer Richard Harris wrote at the time that the press was potentially Mr. Nixon's enemy far more than the courts or Congress, because only the press could dig out and tell the story, whatever help reporters might get from the courts or Congress, in a way that would arouse the people to demand an accounting. 7. Watchdogs do not have to be journalistic behemoths like the New York Times or the Washington Post. In the United Kingdom, a small, independent newspaper called the Rochdale Alternative Paper revealed decades-long abuse allegations against Liberal Party MP 8 Cyril Smith. The exposé in the paper, which had a circulation of 8,000 at its highest 9, eventually led to both a police and an independent government investigation into a child abuse ring that involved several high-level government officials, including MP Peter Morrison, the private secretary to then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. 10. Another way to understand the watchdog function of the press is through the term muckraker, referring to reform-minded investigative journalists during the Progressive Era in the United States, late 1800s to early 1900s, who exposed the wrongdoings of industry leaders. One famous example of a muckraker was Upton Sinclair, who wrote the novel The Jungle based on the corrupt and inhumane practices in American meatpacking companies at the turn of the 20th century. The publication of The Jungle led to governmental action on food safety. In his 1919 work, The Brass Check, Sinclair exposed the journalism industry's penchant for yellow journalism, or journalism that relies on catchy titles and human interest stories to drive sales over well-researched articles or pieces on civic affairs. Sinclair was not afraid to take on media titans such as William Randolph Hearst, who owned the nation's largest chain of newspapers at the time. In an old black and white photograph, a person wearing a suit and tie sits for a portrait. Figure 12. 2. Muckraker Upton Sinclair exposed unethical and unsanitary practice in the U.S. meatpacking industry in The Jungle. Credit: modification of Upton Sinclair, portrait bust, studio at 56 Fifth Ave N. Y by Bain News, Service Library of Congress. Watchdogs and muckrakers act as a check on government action and corruption. They play an important part in exercising the role of a free press as a cornerstone of a functioning democracy. As Yale University professor and member of the Council on Foreign Relations Timothy Snyder writes, "If nothing is true, then no one can criticize power, because there is no basis upon which to do so." 11. The media allows the public to understand what is happening in government in order to hold elected officials accountable. Or, perhaps more simply put, a free press is important because it is the freedom upon which all of our other freedoms are contingent. 12. How free is the press? The answer is not black and white, as evidenced by the 2021 World Press Freedom Index. Published every year by Reporters Without Borders, the Freedom Index measures freedom in 180 countries, based on an evaluation of pluralism, independence of the media, quality of legislative framework, and safety of journalists in each country and region. 13. The map in Figure 12. 3 below shows that the press is freer in some countries, in pink and purple on the map, than in others, in blue and green. A global map shows which areas of the world support a free press. The press is most free in New Zealand and in areas of Northern Europe, and least free in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Northern and Central Africa, and Central America. Figure 12. 3. According to Reporters Without Borders, the free press faces a difficult or very serious situation in nearly half of all countries around the world. Source: Reporters Without Borders. Attribution: Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC by 40 license. According to the index and as reflected in the map, Norway, Finland, Sweden, and Denmark have the freest presses in the world. Notably, Norway tries to discourage media concentration in order to ensure a variety of outlets, something that will be discussed in later parts of this chapter. The 2021 index ranked the United States 44th, after South Africa, 32nd, Botswana, 38th, and South Korea, 42nd. George Mason University professor Sam Lebovic explains that 2 main factors, the rise of concentration in ownership and increased state secrecy, are responsible for the inadequacy of press freedom in the United States, which is an ongoing and serious problem. 14. The modern U.S. media faces unprecedented struggles against declining viewership and revenues, which work to limit the number of outlets and decrease the number of working journalists. At the same time, legislation such as the Patriot Act, passed after the September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks, has made it more difficult for the press to verify state information because of increasing pressure on sources not to cooperate and prosecution of journalists who do ascertain information. In addition, the Trump administration further hampered press freedoms through the prosecution of news sources, public statements that discredited journalists, and encouragement of foreign leaders to take steps to restrict their own media. 15. The future of press freedom in America, while still unstable due to media concentration and surveillance laws such as the Patriot Act, may show some signs of improvement. In a speech on Press Freedom Day in 2021, President Joe Biden decried the imprisonment of 274 reporters worldwide, criticized the lack of local media outlets, and said that the United States recognizes the integral role a free press plays in building prosperous, resilient, and free societies. 16. Despite these laudatory comments about a free press, however, it is clear the United States faces challenges in protecting journalists' ability to fulfill their roles. A study of the United States and Latin America provides an example of how this idea of the importance of a free press is shared across cultures. In the study, journalists representing both cultures shared a common definition of a free press as one that functions without government pressure and to promote social and economic development. 17. This study considered whether or not a free press is related to increased economic development, a question that to date has not been conclusively answered. While the notion that political freedoms, such as freedom of the press, should naturally encourage economic growth and increase standards of living is a common one, current research has not found conclusive evidence either supporting or refuting the claim. 18. There is more of a consensus on the benefits of a free press when it comes to preventing corruption. Studies of press freedom around the world, conducted by scholars in England, Argentina, and Australia, confirm this theory. 19. In this way, the watchdog role that the press plays is based on democratic ideals and has real-world effects for the public. The mediated nature of political information. The political information most people receive is mediated information. What does this mean? Unless they work directly in government, most citizens' understanding of politics comes completely from the media, whether via television news, podcasts, or social media feeds. The media may be a gatekeeper, but it is also a storyteller. As such, it is important to realize that what people see in the media is actually a manufactured view of the political world. Journalists and others who create the news follow routines and are influenced by institutional values that manifest themselves in media content. As Columbia University professor Herbert Gans writes in his study of the American media, the news does not limit itself to reality judgments. It also contains values or preference statements. This in turn makes it possible to suggest that there is, underlying the news, a picture of nation and society as it ought to be. 20 Gans acknowledges that professional journalists try to be objective, yet the news does in fact make judgments and value statements. For example, crime news alerts viewers to the idea that there are undesirable actors within society and that criminals should be punished. Judgments and value statements such as these are different from political bias. While some news outlets are overtly liberal or conservative, Gans's study shows that the media produces stories with cultural values that people may not detect because they are so used to seeing stories presented this way. For example, according to Gans, ethnocentrism and altruistic democracy are two of the key enduring values in the news. Ethnocentrism in the news refers to the idea that the American media values the United States above all other nations. This manifests most obviously in war coverage, where the press rarely questions American involvement, and to do so would be unpatriotic. In a similar vein, Gans explains that the American news media emphasize an altruistic democracy, the ideal held up by the media that politics should be based on public service and for the public interest. 21 In these ways, the news makes statements about what is right and what is wrong and presents political news through these lenses. Journalists also share other professional values as to what makes a good news story, such as proximity, negativity, scope, how big is the story, timeliness, and unexpectedness, novelty. 22 Because journalists share these professional values, there is a certain homogeneous quality to the news, otherwise known as pack journalism. This means that people receive the same type of news story repeatedly, though this has been changing since the advent of online news, a topic that will be discussed later in the chapter. Journalists' common ideas about what should be in the news and why color their coverage and presentation of the news, and, as a result, the public's perception of politics. A large group of reporters wait in a long line outside the White House, many of them holding audio and visual recording equipment. Figure 12. 4 members of the International Press Corps vie for the same story. Credit: Members of the International Press Corps at the White House, by Ben Solomon, U.S. Department of State, GPA Photo Archive/Flickr. Public domain. It is important here to note that the concept of news values differs across countries. What is newsworthy in the United States may not be in other nations, and the role of the media differs as well. A study on the news in Japan found that strong cultural forces and local needs drive how news is produced and delivered. 23 other scholars have found that Western news organizations highlight human interest stories, while Arabic news focuses more on social responsibility and Islamic values. 24 University of Leicester professor Vincent Campbell echoes the sentiment that news organizations in different countries are fueled by different values, and that this influences what stories their audiences see. In authoritarian countries, journalists focus less on performing the watchdog role and more on promoting state activities. 25 This is the case in countries such as North Korea and China, where the state government runs the media. Related to the idea that the media in large part decides what is a good news story is the concept of the media's gatekeeping role and its agenda-setting powers. In other words, according to agenda-setting theory, the media decides both what to ignore or filter out and what to show the public. As University of Texas professor Maxwell McCombs and University of North Carolina professor Donald Shaw write, in choosing and displaying news, editors, newsroom staff, and broadcasters play an important part in shaping political reality. Readers learn not only about a given issue, but also how much importance to attach to that issue from the amount of information in a news story and its position. 26. Whether it is a producer who selects the topics for the evening news or an algorithm that creates a social media newsfeed. People know what is news by what is fed to them. They know what is important based on how often it gets airtime, and they understand that there are lead stories and stories that don't matter very much. The public doesn't make these decisions. Professionals within the news industry make them for the public. Later parts of this chapter will discuss how this power dynamic has changed thanks to social media, and how, in many ways, it is no longer media professionals who select what the public sees. If the media decides which stories to present, it also has a hand in deciding how stories are presented. According to framing theory, the way the media frames political information can affect people's understanding of it. University of Illinois professor David Tewksbury and University of Wisconsin professor Dietram A. Schufel explain. Artists know that the frame placed around a painting can affect how viewers interpret and react to the painting itself. Journalists, often subconsciously, engage in essentially the same process when they decide how to describe the political world. They choose images and words that have the power to influence how audiences interpret and evaluate issues and policies. 27. For example, a study on gubernatorial races found that female candidates were more likely to be framed in terms of personal characteristics than their male counterparts, who were more likely to be framed in terms of their positions on policy issues. 28. In a separate study, researchers found that one common way the Dutch national media framed news on the European Union, EU, was in terms of assigning responsibility for social problems to the government. This study suggests that the Dutch media's presentation of political news reflects the public expectation that the government will provide social welfare programs. 29. By highlighting certain aspects of a story and ignoring others, frames can affect people's judgments and opinions on policy issues. And just as with agenda setting, elected officials fight to make sure they are framed in the correct light. The public and individual viewers should know that while the media is a critical tool that aids people's political decision-making, it is guided by professional values that dictate the content. Individuals' views on politics can sometimes be out of their control, but they can work to assemble a better picture of the world by turning to a variety of media outlets and becoming aware of what goes into story selection. While internal pressures, such as professional norms, or external forces, such as authoritarian governments, can influence how the media portrays information, ownership can also affect what the public sees. The next section will examine the different types of media, and perhaps more importantly, who owns them and how this affects their role in the political world. Learning outcomes. By the end of this section, you will be able to discuss the types of media and their history, explain how ownership affects both media content and consumers and why it is relevant in the study of politics. Compare and contrast state versus privately owned media. The oldest known printed book in the world is the Diamond Sutra, a Buddhist text that was printed using fixed wooden blocks in 868 CE. 30 in the 11th century, roughly 1,000 years later, Chinese inventor Bai Sheng developed movable type, 30, a system of movable letters that could be reused to repeatedly print text. Movable type changed the course of human knowledge and history because it allowed for faster dissemination of information, cheaper printing, and the shareability of printed material. This newfound ability for people to share knowledge challenged traditional authority. And in the 16th century, Pope Alexander VI prohibited unlicensed printing in an attempt to suppress publications that promoted ideas or threatened the Orthodox faith. 32. Video. The Chinese invention of printing and movable type. The Chinese invented paper, printing, and movable type. This video shows how Chinese movable type was developed and how it works. The Pope's actions show that, as English writer and politician Edward Bulwer Lytton wrote, "The pen is mightier than the sword." That is, the ability to spread information freely was an existential threat to traditional power structures. The mass availability of printed material reflects the democratization of knowledge, as education and books were no longer exclusive artifacts of the elite. The media landscape today is very different from when Bai Sheng first created movable type. This section examines the different types of media that exist today, as well as recent significant changes in the media environment, and how these changes affect the media's ability to play the role of gatekeeper and information provider. Types of media and their history. The media can be categorized into 4 broad groups: print, radio, television, and the internet. Print media includes newspapers, magazines, and books. This section will briefly discuss the history and current state of each medium, as well as how ownership of these industries affects the political world. A printing press fills a long room, rolling out large sheets of printed newspaper. Figure 12. 5 newspapers continue to thrive in parts of the developing world. Credit, Day 15, The Press by Lindsay Turner/Flickr, CC by 20. According to Cornell University professor Theodore Lowy, Johns Hopkins University professor Benjamin Ginsberg, and Harvard University professors Kenneth Shepsell and Stephen Anselaper, print media is important for 3 primary reasons. First, other media, including television, radio, and now online news aggregators and podcasts, rely on print media to set the news agenda with original coverage. Second, print media provides more context and details than other forms of media. Finally, print media and its online iterations, such as online versions of newspapers, are the prime information source for the elite. 33. While some have proclaimed that print is dead, there is plenty of evidence to the contrary. Though newspaper circulation has declined, unique visitors to news websites have increased. 34. What has emerged is a symbiosis of print and online media, where traditional flagship news sources, such as the New York Times and various magazines, move online to recapture waning audiences, while some previously online-only sources launch physical magazines. In December 2020, Forbes ran an aptly named article titled, "Stop Saying Print Journalism is Dead." 60 magazines launched during this crazy year, pointing out that people still like print, and as University of Texas professor Iris Chi explains, the reason for this is biological. Tangible material leaves a deeper footprint in the brain. 36. A study of democratic European countries confirmed the same phenomenon. Print media is still resilient in the face of an expanding online environment. 37. Commercial Observer reporter Chava Guriri explains the phenomenon this way. It seems print and digital can coexist after all. The new won't replace the old. The new will hammer the old, deform it, reform it, reconceive, reconfigure, but the old won't disappear. 38 later parts of this chapter will further investigate the impact of the internet on traditional media. Print media has not suffered as much in other parts of the world, particularly in developing countries. A 2011 Pew Research Center study found that print newspapers are thriving in countries with untapped and emerging population segments. In some parts of the world, such as India, reading a print newspaper is a prestigious activity, in much the same way that it was for immigrants a century ago in the United States. 39. And increased literacy in developing countries also contributes to this trend. 40. Newspaper circulation increased by double digits in South America, Asia, and Africa between 2004 and 2009. 41. A bulky, oblong radio from the early 1950s, with a large dial and speakers, is shown on a tabletop. Figure 12. 6. In the first half of the 20th century, before the rise of television, radio was a prominent source of news and entertainment in the United States. Credit: Vintage Zenith Bakelite AM/FM table radio. 7 tubes, model H72372, circa 1951, by Joe Haupt/Flickr, CC by 2. 0. The first commercial radio station was born in the United States on November 2, 1920, when Pittsburgh's Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company transmitted the first scheduled broadcast, announcing live returns of the presidential election contest between Warren G. Harding and James Cox. Westinghouse obtained the first U.S. commercial broadcasting station license in the same year, and 7 years later, the Radio Act of 1927 created the Federal Radio Commission to oversee radio broadcasting, replacing the Department of Commerce in its oversight duties. 42. This marked the beginning of what has come to be known as the Golden Age of radio. From the late 1920s until the early 1950s, when radio broadcasts were millions of Americans' primary source of news and entertainment. 43. Television would soon overtake radio as the primary form of entertainment in the home. But as of 2019, radio programming still reached more Americans than any other media platform. 44. While the United States is considered the largest and most important radio market, other developed countries constitute important markets for radio broadcasters. The United Nations continues to celebrate the radio on World Radio Day, hailing the humble technology as a vector of freedom, because radio supplies low-cost information and remains a widely used technology around the globe. 45. Show me the data. A graph shows the top 10 global radio markets, with the United States representing more than half of all annual global radio revenue. The United States generates $81 billion in revenue, whereas Germany, which ranks second, generates $388 billion in revenue. China, Canada, the United Kingdom, France, Japan, Australia, Spain, and Italy round out the top 10. Figure 12. 7. The United States represents more than half of all annual global radio revenue. Sources: Ofcom, Canadian Radio Television and Telecommunications Commission, Statista. Attribution: Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC by 4.0 license. The first black and white television was introduced at the 1939 World's Fair 46, and in 1941, the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, the U.S. government commission that currently oversees radio, television, wire, and now the Internet, authorized commercial broadcasting in the United States. 47. The introduction of color television quickly followed in the early 1950s, and by the 1980s, around 90% of American households had a television. 48. This era is what Queensland University of Technology professor Amanda D. Lotz terms the network era, when three major television networks had a fixed schedule and provided the majority of media content. During this era, most homes had one television, and television was a means of bringing the outside world into the home. 49. Coaxial cable television was first developed in the 1930s to provide television to rural areas that could not receive broadcast signals. Cable television became more widespread starting in the 1950s and culminating in the 1970s with the introduction of home box office, HBO, which fought with the FCC to be allowed to provide for-fee television content through a cable network. 50. Steady growth of the industry peaked in the early 2000s, and by 2010, more than 105 million Americans, or about 90% of homes, paid for cable television services. 51. Yet the number of Americans who said they watched television via cable or satellite plunged from 76% in 2015 to 56% in 202,152, while a recent Deloitte consulting study found that 82% of respondents subscribed to a streaming service. 53. The trend of moving from traditional television to streaming or mobile services can be seen elsewhere in the world, though it is progressing at a slower pace. In India in 2018, 197 million households had televisions, while only a fraction of that number, 60 million, utilized the country's most popular on-demand media programming. 54. A multi-level structure with rough openings for windows and a metal roof sits along the side of a treed mountain road. A sign on the front of the structure says Cafe Internet Restaurant. Two backpackers walk up the road in the foreground. Figure 12. 8. At the beginning of the 21st century, only about 3% of the population of Peru had internet access. The internet has spread rapidly, and while about 43% of the population of Peru still did not have regular internet access in 2019, internet cafes like this one have sprung up in Peru and around the world, connecting people and places like never before. Credit: Cafe Internet by Daniel Lobo/Flickr, public domain. The Advanced Research Projects Agency Network, ARPANET, which was established through the U.S. Department of Defense in the early 1960s, built on research conducted by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology to fund and administer one of the first iterations of the Internet. 55 by 1969, ARPANET mainly connected research universities to one another. But at the urging of the telecommunication and computer industry, the government was persuaded to open up the network for public use. In 1993, the European Organization for Nuclear Research, CERN, put the technology into the public domain 56 thanks to the research of MIT professor Tim Berners-Lee, who created the framework for the World Wide Web and the use of links and hyperlinks. The Internet has, of course, altered the way people interact with every communication medium. Never have people been able to access so much information at once from one place, be it with a laptop or a smartphone. As of 2021, 97% of all adults owned a cell phone and 87% owned a smartphone. Over 95% of Americans ages 18 to 49 reported using a smartphone. 57, a 2018 survey found that, worldwide, a median of 76% of the populations of 18 advanced economies had smartphones compared to just 45% in emerging economies, with South Korea reporting the highest smartphone adoption rate at 95%. 58, in 2020, more than 80% of Americans got their news from a smartphone, while only 10% got news from a printed newspaper. 59 of those using online news, more than half of Americans said they get their news from social media, at least sometimes. And a third of Americans stated that they regularly get news from Facebook. 60 later parts of this chapter will investigate the role of social media in more depth. Ownership of the media. Between print media, radio, television, and streaming services, it feels like people have a lot of choice when it comes to media. However, the United States and Europe have what is called media concentration, where a few firms own the majority of channels and content. In fact, 5 companies own and produce 90% of what Americans watch today. 61, another word to describe this type of media ownership pattern, in which a small number of corporations dominate the market, is an oligopoly. Infographic of the media oligopoly in the U.S. shows that 5 large corporations Comcast, Viacom CBS, Disney, AT&T, and News Corp own numerous major news and media outlets like HBO, Telemundo, Paramount Pictures, Lucasfilm, CNN, Warner Bros., and The Wall Street Journal, as well as the big 3 television networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC. Together, these 5 corporations control about 90% of the U.S. media market. Figure 12. 5 major multinational corporations control about 90% of U.S. media markets. A similar oligopoly exists in Europe. Attribution. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC BY 40 license. Is media concentration a cause for concern? Columbia Business School professor Eli Noem argues that larger corporations have the money to invest in good journalists and foster reader loyalty. 62. Since being acquired by Amazon owner Jeff Bezos, the Washington Post has increased hiring and has shown profitability, unlike many other newspapers. 63. However, because these companies are privately owned, it is not irrational to assume that they are profit-seeking businesses that look to maximize earnings over other, perhaps loftier, goals. As such, these companies may choose easy-to-sell programming over content with high information value. Providence College professor Matt Gardino writes, "When control over the media is concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, owners may be able to use their corporations, powerful platforms to amplify propaganda driven by their own political views or business interests." 64. In addition, profit maximization can lead to budgetary constraints such as reduced foreign news coverage or other staffing cutbacks, which can affect the content of the news and, by extension, what information citizens and voters can access. A 2018 study found that ownership chains had a homogenizing effect on the content of newspapers' coverage of foreign policy, resulting in coverage across co-owned papers that is more similar in scope. What they cover. Focus, how much hard relative to soft news they offer, and diversity, the breadth of topics they include in their coverage of a given issue relative to papers that are not co-owned. 65. As senior research and teaching associate at University of Zurich Etta Humprecht notes, Large media corporations are assumed to offer superficial or scandalizing news content in order to attract large audiences. 66. And this idea has been backed by various empirical studies that point to the reduction of more serious news in favor of content with what is perceived to be higher entertainment value. Stanford researcher Mark Cooper iterates this point. Concentration of ownership may foster entertainment variety, but it undermines diversity of information and journalistic enterprise. 67. He also notes that concentration of media ownership reduces the diversity of local reporting and gives dominant firms in local markets an immense amount of power to influence critical decisions. Consolidation in national chains squeezes out the local point of view. 68. A study of the Sinclair Broadcasting Group, which provides news to more than 70% of American households, found that news outlets under concentrated ownership focused on national news over local interest, produced slightly more politically conservative content, and resulted in a small downward shift in viewership. 69. This is troubling when considered alongside research that finds that smaller station groups produce higher quality newscasts than stations owned by larger companies, by a significant margin. 70. It is not difficult to see how ownership affects not just what people see, but also what they consider important, and how that can affect the public's view of politics. The picture of media ownership in Europe is similar to that in the United States in that 6 corporations also own the majority of media content across Europe, prompting the European Union to commission the 2020 report Monitoring Media Pluralism in the Digital Era 71, and to issue a warning about the threat that media concentration poses to pluralism and diversity of views. The European Federation of Journalists echoes this concern. Many politicians, particularly those in the European Parliament, have repeatedly expressed concerns over the growth of huge media companies that are exercising unprecedented levels of political and commercial influence. In the process, they threaten diversity and pluralism in society. 72. Private ownership is not the only media model. In many countries outside of the United States, the media are either partially or wholly owned by the state with positive effects. For example, the British Broadcasting Corporation, BBC, the world's first public broadcaster. 73, draws its funding via the government in the form of a user fee while not having any direct government intervention when it comes to programming or editing. Many hail the BBC as a model for public ownership because of its high-quality news, content, and accessibility. Countries that have strong public broadcasters, such as the BBC, have been shown to have higher levels of social trust, and the people who live in them are less likely to hold extremist political views. 74. Public news media continue to play a particularly prominent role in Western Europe, where public news stations, including the BBC in the UK, Sveriges Television, SVT, and Sveriges Radio, SR in Sweden, and ARD in Germany, continue to be top sources for news. 75. However, in poorer, autocratic nations, state ownership of the media has been shown to undermine political and economic rights and freedoms. 76. In the United States, the 2 highest-profile public news outlets, National Public Radio, NPR, and the Public Broadcasting Service, PBS, rank far lower than private news outlets in terms of listeners and viewership. 77. Learning outcomes. By the end of this section, you will be able to describe why the media are needed to cover elections and how they do it. Explain the importance of the media for candidates running for election. Detail the pros and cons of advertising in elections. Video. The scream that doomed Howard Dean. Howard Dean's 2004 presidential campaign had been building momentum until this now infamous speech doomed his campaign. Most Americans know about Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech, but do you know about Howard Dean's "I Have a Scream" speech? During the 2004 presidential campaign, Democratic candidate and former Vermont Governor Howard Dean led many polls for the Democratic presidential nomination. The press seemed to adore the progressive, anti-war candidate, though he placed third in the Iowa caucus behind Massachusetts Senator John Kerry and North Carolina Senator John Edwards. In order to rally his supporters, Dean gave a speech at Val Air Ballroom in West Des Moines, Iowa. Perhaps trying to project an image of optimism and future victory, Dean promised that his campaign was going to South Dakota and Oregon and Washington and Michigan. He then assured the crowd that he would ultimately go to Washington, D.C., to take back the White House. 78, before releasing a long, shrill scream into his microphone. That scream and that moment, now referred to as Dean's "I Have a Scream" speech, were played 633 times by national networks in the ensuing days. 79, with CNN eventually issuing a formal apology for playing it too many times. 80, some refer to this event as the first viral political event, and many consider it the moment when the Dean campaign died. What it illustrates is the sometimes adversarial, sometimes symbiotic relationship between elected officials and the media. Media coverage of elections and elected officials. As Stanford University professor Shanto Iyengar writes, for most Americans, the media are their only contact with the world of public affairs. 81 Iyengar explains that one of the media's critical functions is to provide a forum for candidates and parties to discuss their platforms and qualifications. Earlier parts of this chapter have detailed the media's roles as watchdog and storyteller. When it comes to elections, they also act as information provider. Without the media, it would be very difficult for voters to assess which candidates to vote for and whether or not to keep incumbent legislators in office. This means, however, that elected officials can try to manipulate the media to make themselves seem more appealing, and the media also must be careful in how they portray candidates and the electoral process. All topics that will be covered in more detail in the following sections. One of the most significant powers of the media is determined by both its reach and how it acts as an agenda setter, alerting people to important issues. By constantly putting political issues and elections in their news cycle, the media reinforce the idea that participating in democracy is important. However, while Americans feel informed by coverage of campaigns, they have lukewarm feelings about the breadth of coverage, noting a lack of attention to substantial issues. 82. This is a common refrain from scholars as well. Decades of academic research have shown that the news media engage too often in the horse race coverage aspect of elections, reporting on who is ahead and who is behind rather than on substantial issues or policy stances. Harvard professor Thomas Patterson writes that the press is obsessed with the horse race of elections, and this, coupled with the unique and prolonged length of the U.S. primaries and general election, makes the coverage seem even more endless in nature. 83, for example, in the 2020 election, the earliest caucus was February 3, and the earliest primary was February 11, 9 months before the general election. 84, however, this does not take into account what is called the invisible primary, when potential candidates begin to raise money for their campaigns, often months before the actual campaign season starts. The U.S. campaign season feels interminable, especially when compared to countries such as Singapore, where general elections must take place in the span of 3 months once Parliament is dissolved. 85 horse race coverage has been linked to greater levels of distrust of both candidates and the media themselves. It gives an advantage to novel candidates. Think former professional wrestler Jesse Ventura, who ran for and won the office of Minnesota governor in 1998, and ignores third-party candidates, such as Gary Johnson, who ran for president in 2020 as the Libertarian Party candidate. 86. This problem is not unique to the United States. A study of 27 European countries found that horse race coverage was prominent in party systems with close electoral competitions, and in countries with large media markets. 87, and another study found similar criticisms of Australian election coverage. 88. Horse race journalism is not an equally severe problem in all democratic nations. One study of the media in Sweden found that compared to the United States, the Swedish press did a better job with issue-oriented reporting and the production of interpretive news during their elections. 89. Horse race coverage is problematic not just because it turns off viewers. It also ignores topics in which voters might be interested in favor of coverage of who is winning and who is losing. This undermines the importance of the media as an information provider and watchdog when it comes to the electoral process. The horse race approach is not the only problem with media election coverage. A trend since the 1980s, the media's tendency toward negative, critical coverage of candidates remains problematic. As Thomas Patterson writes, this incessant stream of criticism has a corrosive effect. It needlessly erodes trust in political leaders and institutions and undermines confidence in government and policy, which can mislead voters about the choices they face. A study of Canadian elections found that negative media portrayals of candidates and elections can depress a voter's intention to cast a ballot. 91. When it comes to media and elections, some countries, including democratic countries, face a bigger problem: the lack of press freedom. In 2016, 3 of Japan's most outspoken news anchors were dismissed from their positions due to governmental pressure in reaction to their criticisms of then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Shortly after their firing, a United Nations representative expressed alarm at the country's declining support for press freedom, while the Paris-based media advocacy group Reporters Without Borders lowered Japan's ranking of world press freedom to 72nd out of 180 nations, between Tanzania and Lesotho. 92. In Mexico, despite promises to regulate the use of government funds for public relations, former President Enrique Peña Nieto spent nearly $2 billion of government money on media advertising in 5 years during his tenure, with the expectation that he would receive positive news coverage in return. 93. The examples of Japan and Mexico are a reminder of how crucial a free press is in the political process. The media has the capability to quickly reach wide audiences, including elites and the broader public. It can help generate collective action, it provides information that is needed to make political decisions, and it helps candidates reach potential voters. Meet a professional. Robert Yoon, CNN Director of Political Research, 1999-2017. Election Analyst, Edison Research, 2018-present. Please explain what you do for your organization. At CNN, I was responsible for knowing pretty much anything about a candidate or public official that might be relevant for our news coverage. I collected information about their fundraising and their personal finances and their policy positions, and whatever notable things they might have said in interviews or on the campaign trail. I've covered politics on a lot of different levels, including the U.S. Senate and House and the Supreme Court and governors, and to some extent local races. But my main focus has always been presidential campaigns. Even though presidential elections happen only every 4 years, someone somewhere is always either running for president or thinking about it. So I had to follow a lot of these micro-developments when most people weren't paying much attention to it. The hardest and most interesting part of my job probably was preparing moderators for presidential debates. I've done more than 30 presidential debates, most recently a 2020 debate for CBS News. My other big responsibility was analyzing election night vote results. Can you tell me a little about how you got involved in your position? I was always interested in politics and current events. As a kid, I would always watch the State of the Union and try to name cabinet secretaries as they entered the House chamber. Watching election night coverage was like watching the Super Bowl or the World Series. So when I saw a posting for a job at CNN to help cover presidential elections, I jumped at the chance. What advice would you give students who want to go into your line of work? An important thing for any journalist is to consume as much information as you can as regularly as possible, even if it isn't directly related to your main interests. Journalists cover real life, so the more you know and understand the ways of the world, the better. Having a wide range of experiences and being exposed to a wide variety of perspectives makes you a better reporter. How do candidates use the media? Surrounded by his immediate family, Donald Trump speaks from a stage in front of U.S. and Iowa flags. Several members of the assembled audience hold up smartphones and other digital recording devices. Figure 12. 10. When Donald Trump addressed supporters after finishing in the top 3 in the Iowa Republican caucuses in 2016, audience members captured his speech on their smartphones. Credit: Trump Caucus by Max Goldberg /GPA Photo Archive /Flickr. CC by 20. The media is an important tool for voters, one that allows them to learn more about candidates and the election process. For candidates, the media also serves as a tool to reach those very same voters. And this section will discuss how candidates use the media in the hopes of winning elections. There are two avenues for candidates to use the media: free media and paid media. Free media is when a candidate gets press coverage, while paid media refers to media that the candidate and campaign pay for in the form of political ads. Paid media will be discussed in more detail later in the chapter. When former Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto spent nearly $2 billion of government money on media advertising, his actions were particularly nefarious because he used government funds to purchase paid media in order to influence free media coverage. 94 in the United States, for example, presidents can only use money raised through separate campaign entities to fund paid media. Using government funds would be considered not only corrupt, but also illegal. In Peña Nieto's case, his flagrant abuse of power was met with defeat at the polls. In the United States and many other countries, successful campaigns are increasingly contingent upon candidates, media strategies, and media treatment of political events. 95 savvy candidates understand that they should not simply let the media decide how to cover them, and that they need to present themselves in a certain light to potential voters. Candidates aim to control the media narrative and spend significant time and money trying to do so. And this struggle is international. In a study of 97 candidates in 43 elections around the world, scholars found that candidates who employed nastier rhetoric that included personal attacks and appealed to people's fears received wider media attention. Media attention that candidates want during an election, especially as the study found that media coverage of personal attacks was correlated with electoral success. 96 along the same lines, scholars in the UK found that critical, unbalanced media coverage of the EU that focused on the perceived threats of immigrants contributed to Brexit, the British exit from the European Union. 97 members of the United Kingdom Independence Party, UKIP, sought this type of media coverage in order to influence the outcome of the ballot initiative for UK independence. The Cambridge Analytica scandal highlights the worst of paid media campaigns, as British consultants from Cambridge Analytica scraped Facebook data from users without their knowledge. This questionably, and in many countries, illegally obtained data was used to create micro-targeted ads tailored to specific users. For the Donald Trump presidential campaign, the Ted Cruz senatorial campaign, and the Brexit campaign. It was also alleged that Russian oil company Lukoil, which has strong ties to the Putin-led Russian government, was involved in funding Cambridge Analytica to influence the outcome of the U.S. presidential election. 98. Cambridge Analytica illustrates just how far candidates will go to use media, in this case, social media, which will be discussed in more detail in later parts of this chapter, to win at all costs. In the 2020 presidential election, Donald Trump's campaign bought $1 million in Facebook ads, alone 99, though this number pales in comparison to the amount the campaigns spent on television ads. Joe Biden spent more than $600 million on television ads, while Trump spent $400 million, the bulk of it in 6 battleground states: Florida, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Wisconsin, and Arizona. 100 These massive campaign advertising expenditures are not common in all countries. For example, in 2008, the U.S. presidential election cost candidates $5.3 billion, with a large portion of that going toward media buys. In comparison, thanks in part to a complete ban on political advertising on television, the 2007 Danish election cost only $8 million, including public financing, and had a turnout rate that was 25 percentage points higher than the turnout rate in the U.S. 101 Germany also bans political advertisements and has a tradition of using political posters as a practical way of influencing voters. 102. A large political poster for German Chancellor Angela Merkel stands alongside a wide sidewalk on a city street in Germany. Figure 12. 11 This photo shows a roadside political poster for the re-election of German Chancellor Angela Merkel. Credit: election poster of Angela Merkel in Hamburg by T-Meister/Flickr, CC by 2. 0. As described earlier in this chapter, media coverage of campaigns that is negative and focuses on the horse race aspect of elections rather than on issues can have detrimental effects. The same can be said for paid media. A problematic form of paid media is the negative attack ad, the numbers of which have only continued to rise. Campaign finance scholar Fred Wertheimer writes, "Because television appeals to our emotions and magnifies and intensifies what it communicates, the impact of the negative message is much more powerful and damaging on television than if the same message were being communicated through print." 103. Negative advertising is problematic for obvious reasons. It can lead voters to distrust their own decisions, and it breeds contempt for the election process. 104. Show me the data. A graph shows the ratio of negative, contrasting, and positive political ads in the United States in 2000, 2004, 2008, and 2012. Overall, ads have been trending in a steadily increasing negative direction. The average number of positive ads decreased from 40% in 2000 to under 30% in 2004 and 2008 to just over 10% in 2012. The average number of negative ads rose from 30% in 2000 to roughly 45% in 2004 to just under 50% in 2008 and to over 60% in 2012. Figure 12. The percentage of negative ads in U.S. political campaigns has grown steadily since 2000. Source: Wesleyan Media Project. Attribution: Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC by 4. 0 license. The effects of negative ads are still debated, as a number of studies say that they do not necessarily affect turnout because legitimate criticism of candidates can actually drive voter turnout. 105. Another reason why negative ads may have little to no effect is that they are only salient to voters who already have low levels of trust in government to begin with. In other words, the ads preach to the choir and have little effect on the overall voting body. 106. Multiple studies 107 have also shown that negative ads may work in the opposite direction, 1.8, which is to say that the attacker comes away looking worse. Effectiveness aside, negative or otherwise, the First Amendment protects political advertising as a form of speech separate from commercial speech, specifically because it is speech that is political in nature. Political advertisements on television are a vital tool for candidates because they can reach voters quickly, and these ads allow candidates to package and present themselves on their own terms. 109. Given the strong First Amendment protections in the United States, political ads are here to stay. Learning outcomes. By the end of this section, you will be able to describe how the internet and social media has changed other forms of media. Understand the impact of social media on politics. Detail how social media in particular has different effects on how we understand and interact with politics and political information. Narendra Modi, Barack Obama, Joko Widodo, Donald Trump, Queen Rania, and Hillary Clinton. What do these names make you think of? Hopefully politics. They also happen to be the most popular politicians on Instagram. 110. Why would politicians want to be on the same platform as dogs dressed up in tutus and one-pot cooking recipes? Because around the world, people spend close to 2.5 hours a day on social media, and because never before has anyone been able to reach a global audience so quickly and so intimately. The internet and social media have changed everything about people's lives, from how they connect to how they understand politics. This section will discuss how the internet has transformed traditional media and changed how the news is produced and shared, the impact of social media on politics, and how the effects of social media differ from those of traditional media. Show me the data. A bar graph shows the proportion of people in 6 countries using different news media in April 2020. In all selected countries, the largest percentages used online sources, including social media. 69% in Germany, 73% in the USA, 79% in the UK, 83% in Spain, 85% in South Korea, and 90% in Argentina. TV was the second most popular source of information, while print media and radio were used least in all 6 countries. Figure 12. 13. In most countries, people rely heavily on online news sources. Source: Reuters Institute Digital News Report 2020. Attribution. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC BY 40 license. In some ways, the table in Figure 12:13 says it all. While circulation and advertising revenue of print media have dropped considerably and viewership of television has also slowed, the share of people who go online for news and entertainment has grown steadily. The allure of internet content and social media is easy to understand. The most popular platforms and much of the content are for the most part free, easy to use, highly visual in nature, and dynamic. When it comes to social media, the networked nature of the technology, being connected to multiple other networks of people, is also what makes it so powerful, as this characteristic is what allows users to share information and links quickly and often. 111. The internet and social media have become everything: a tool for information, a tool for entertainment, a way to communicate, and a way to become empowered. At the advent of the technology, many lauded the internet's transformative nature because it altered the traditional power structure of the media. In traditional print, radio, and television, the journalists, editors, and producers engaged in gatekeeping. They choose what news or entertainment to publish or air based on their own tastes, professional norms, and their interpretation of audience expectations. Because social media allows users to rapidly share and create their own content, it has weakened the traditional gatekeeping model of mainstream media. This is possible because the internet substantially lowers the barriers to entry or the economic cost of a newcomer being part of the process. No longer do people need a professional cameraman, $1 million set, editors, high-tech editing equipment, a satellite, or a license to broadcast. All they need is a computer, iPad, or phone. This is not to say that traditional media has fallen away. The most trafficked sites online continue to be old guard outlets, such as the New York Times and CNN. At the same time, sites that started online, as opposed to those that moved online, such as Yahoo, BuzzFeed, Mashable, TechCrunch, and many others, stand side by side in popularity with the old guard. 112. The fact that twice as many kids want to be YouTube stars as want to be astronauts. 113 is a sure sign of the power of the internet and social networking platforms. Children and teens are not blind to TikTok influencer Charli D'Amelio's 100 million plus followers. 114, and they envision endless possibilities for themselves. The internet can feel empowering to individual users in ways that traditional media never could, because the potential to become famous or viral on social media, and the internet only takes content, not millions of dollars backed by a movie studio or an anchor on a news network. But it also needs the help of an algorithm. Video. The Young Turks, Building Hope. The Young Turks is a popular YouTube news content channel that started in the living room of creator-host Cenk Uygur. Simply defined, algorithms are mathematical sets of rules. When applied to social media platforms and search engines, algorithms play a critical role in what people see when they search for a topic in a search engine or what comes across their social media feeds. Algorithms search, sort, and rank things based on predictions about what users should see, which means what comes up in one person's search results and social media feed will be different from what comes up in other people's results and feeds. This is accomplished by the use of cookies, or blocks of data that allow web browsers to track and save information about the sites people visit. By utilizing cookies, social media algorithms predict what users want to see in an attempt to keep them engaged online. Because what one person chooses will be different from what any other individual chooses, the content of their social media stream will look different from anyone else's. This represents a monumental shift in how media is presented to users. In the 1970s and 1980s, when there were only 4 or 5 television stations to watch, all content was delivered to viewers at the same time, in the same fashion. The most watched television finale in the history of U.S. television was the last episode of M****S**H, a comedy set during the Korean War. 115, this meant that more than 105 million people watched the finale at the same time, something unimaginable to younger viewers today, who can stream almost anything, from sports to comedies to YouTube videos, on demand. This is due to another unique characteristic of online content, which is that it is asynchronous content, or content that can be shared among a network of people outside the constraints of time and space. For the vast majority of college students, and increasingly for their parents, using social media makes perfect sense. They were born into the technology and cannot remember life without it. Universities and colleges are ground zero for experimentation and political socialization. And increasingly, college students are using social media in ways that promote the creation of social capital and political participation. A study of university students in the United States, Australia, and Britain found that they are adept social media users and that they are aware of both its practical value and its limitations. The study notes that social media platforms are an increasingly significant sphere for the political messaging, discussion, disruption, and the presentation of the political self among college students. 116, but it is worth it to stop and ask why social media is so useful for politics in general. As New York University professor Clay Shirky notes, for generations, the formation of groups has relied on traditional institutional structures. Think political parties or the Freemasons. The advent of social media has transformed group formation and even global cooperation. 117, social media, Shirky explains, have become coordinating tools for nearly all of the world's political movements, just as most of the world's authoritarian governments, and, alarmingly, an increasing number of democratic ones, are trying to limit access to it. 118.1 can see the potential of social media as a valuable organizing tool for political movements in the case of the Arab Spring, during which social media users organized wide-scale protests, first against the government of Tunisia, with additional pro-democracy movements spreading across much of the Middle East and North Africa. In Egypt, a Google executive named Wael Ghanem created the Facebook page, "We Are All Called," said, to protest the murder of a 28-year-old Egyptian man at the hands of Egyptian police. The page, which had 300 users within 2 minutes of its creation, swelled to 250,000 users within 3 months. 119 Ghanem was later imprisoned and interrogated for his Facebook activities, criticizing the Egyptian government. Upon release, he gave a televised speech that led to further protests, which in turn ultimately led to the resignation of Egyptian then-President Hosni Mubarak. 120 in China, social media has been a valuable tool of empowerment for political dissidents. Journalist Emily Parker writes that, via social media, millions of wangmen or netizens are surrounded, at least virtually, by like-minded individuals. They learn the power of collective action. They become parts of networks that extend outside their country's borders. 121, while authoritarian governments such as China's have long tried to control the spread of information, ordinary citizens have long used creative ways to get around these controls. 122 contemporary Chinese artist Ai Weiwei, an early Twitter adopter, famously used the social media platform to alert people outside of China to the government's corrupt activities. In this black and white photograph, Ai Weiwei stands in front of a brick wall looking at the screen of a cell phone he holds horizontally at the end of his outstretched arm. Figure 12. 14 Chinese artist and political activist Ai Weiwei has more than 367,000 followers on Twitter. Credit: Ai Weiwei by Alfred Weidinger/Flickr, CC by 2. 0. In this way, social media can create social cohesion, facilitate collaboration, and serve as an indispensable tool for activists. However, the technology has its drawbacks, particularly when it comes to politics. Online environments in which the same opinions are repeatedly voiced and promoted to the exclusion of opposing views, often referred to as echo chambers, are a recurring and real problem. For example, Twitter users are, to a great extent, exposed to opinions that agree with their own, and bipartisan users are not rewarded in terms of visibility on the platform. 123 echo chambers are problematic in that they are linked to political polarization, or the divergence of political attitudes toward ideological extremes. Social media is particularly ripe for this problem, because the technology allows users to silo themselves off more easily than traditional media does. However, as University of Chicago professor Cass Sunstein notes, citizens within a democratic system require shared experiences, and when individuals can restrict themselves to hearing only voices they agree with, only louder echoes of their own voices. 124. This will lead to political fragmentation and political polarization. This is not a uniquely American phenomenon. A study of the 2011 Canadian election found evidence of political polarization on Twitter 125, while a 2014 study similarly concluded that Twitter led to more political polarization than it did cross-ideological discourse, though such discourse on Twitter did appear possible. 126 comparative research on the 2013 U.S. and French presidential elections found polarization among Twitter users in both countries, though at a higher level in France. 127 research on Facebook usage during the 2014 Thai presidential election also supports the claim that users do not engage in cross-ideological discussion, but instead sequester themselves in politically homogeneous social media pages. 128 political polarization results in lower levels of trust in institutions, higher levels of suspicion of the other side, and the inability to work toward compromise. 129 media concentration, covered in an earlier section of this chapter, can also contribute to political polarization because the media oligopolies have the resources to create a plethora of niche and partisan media. As University of Antwerp professor Peter van Aelst writes, the success of partisan news broadcasters, such as Fox News and MSNBC, and online platforms such as Breitbart and the Huffington Post in the USA, also contributes to the view that there is a trend towards increasing polarization of media content. 130 research has found that exposure to partisan information makes people more inclined to support their own positions in an entrenched manner. 131. What can I do? The media and personal responsibility. 3 rectangular screens displayed side by side on a wall show rotating front pages of newspapers from around the world. Signs on the wall above the screens read, "Today's news from around the world" and "How the world sees the world." A snapshot view of what's important to different people on the planet. Figure 12. 15. This display of the front pages of newspapers around the world provides a snapshot view of what's important to people around the planet. Credit, newspapers by Alper/Flickr, CC by 20. The media play a critical role in helping people understand the political world around them. For example, the media provide information about what governments are doing and inform voters about candidates running for office. What people often do not think about, however, is how individuals engage with and utilize the information that they receive from the media. Information is one of the most powerful tools available to the public, particularly when thinking about specific information related to government and politics. Do individuals use this information in an ethical manner? Do they think about what choices are available to them based on the information provided? Do they fully understand all of the actions and consequences of those actions based on the information provided? By studying how the media works as a political institution and with political institutions, and how people interact with the media and the information provided by the media, you can begin to understand your own personal responsibility vis-à-vis the media. In an era when social media can spread disinformation almost instantaneously or exacerbate political polarization, it is important to really consider and take into account how your actions concerning media utilization impact those around you. The loss of the traditional gatekeeper is one explanation for the existence of the echo chambers, polarization, and self-segregation that allow for an alarming increase in misinformation, or incorrect information that is spread regardless of intent to mislead. Disinformation is misinformation that is explicitly intended to mislead. As Senior Vice President and the Director of the Technology and Public Policy Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, James Andrew Lewis writes, the effect of the Internet on the mediation of content is especially pronounced, with a decentralized media displacing the editors and fact-checkers of the past. Social media amplifies the trend toward disintermediation. 132, in other words, When people got political information from the newspaper or television in the past, they knew that there were institutional checks in place, from editors to fact-checkers to the journalists themselves, to ensure its accuracy. Now, anyone with internet access can be a journalist, and no one needs a news station to create news. In this way, the internet has democratized news production and empowered previously ignored voices while simultaneously creating a minefield of misinformation. The networked nature of social media platforms makes it easy to pass along misinformation. Studies of Twitter have shown that falsehoods travel further and faster than the truth, thanks in part to the emotional responses they elicit and in part to the novelty of the falsehoods themselves. Perhaps more notably, studies found that it is the work not of bots, automated internet applications that run repetitive tasks such as retweeting, but of people retweeting falsehoods that cause disinformation to spread so quickly. 133. The Center for Countering Digital Hate found that only 12 people were responsible for 65% of the misinformation spread online about COVID-19 vaccines. 134. In addition, the internet and social media make it easier for foreign agents to spread disinformation online. In a report issued for the U.S. State Department in 2019, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea were highlighted as the worst offenders, spending millions of dollars on state-backed activities designed to actively spread disinformation. 135. Herein lies the paradox of the intersection between social media and politics. The technology can be a revolutionary tool for creating and dispersing information and encouraging broader political participation. But it is this very participation and ease of information production and dissemination that leads to such high levels of misinformation. Media scholars such as Lion Chinfook and Heather Simmons are hopeful that new gatekeepers will evolve to allow for a healthier information environment on social media platforms in the future. 136. Learning outcomes. By the end of this section, you will be able to detail levels of trust in the media in the U.S. and around the world. Discuss why levels of trust in the media have steadily declined. Explain why we should care about levels of trust in the media. Explain what possible reforms can increase trust in the media. Every time a newspaper dies, even a bad one, the country moves a little closer to authoritarianism. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Richard Kluger. The beginning of this chapter discussed how the press safeguards people's rights and keeps democracy healthy. Authoritarian regimes such as North Korea do not allow freedom of the press because they know that an informed citizenry is a powerful one. Despite the inherent importance of the media, levels of trust in the institution are precariously low both in the United States and globally. This section will examine levels of trust in the media and the causes of mistrust, then go on to examine possible reforms. Do people trust the media? In order for the media to fulfill its goals as a gatekeeper and purveyor of information, there needs to be trust in the institution. So why do some countries trust the media more than others? A study of 44 countries found that factors such as higher levels of political interest, interpersonal trust, and exposure to television news and newspapers are positively correlated with trust in media, while education and exposure to news on the internet are negatively associated with levels of trust in the media. The same study showed that ownership also affects levels of trust. State ownership of television is positively associated with trust in media in democratic societies and negatively associated with trust in media in non-democratic societies. 137 other reports have found that levels of democracy and media freedom are not necessarily correlated with trust in the media. Evaluations of the economy also have been suggested as a factor in people's trust in the media. 138. A 2019 Gallup report on global trust in the media noted that the percentage of respondents who expressed at least some trust in journalists ranged from a low of 12% in Greece to a high of 93% in Uzbekistan. 139. Most people around the globe trust people they know personally over people they know through online exchanges, and there appears to be a healthy skepticism of online news and content in general. Some question whether increased political polarization has contributed to lower levels of trust in the media. Given the apparent causal relationship between political polarization and online echo chambers, perhaps the relationship between trust in the media and political polarization is more analogous to the well-worn question about which came first, the chicken or the egg. Wilfrid Laurier University professor Ann Wilson, PhD candidate Victoria Parker, and University of Toronto professor Matthew Feinberg describe this as a polarization feedback loop, in which increasing polarization among political elites and the media selectively amplifies the worst the other side has to offer and ultimately feeds into mistrust of the media and polarization of the electorate. 140. The schism is particularly apparent in the United States, where political partisanship is evident not only across many policy issues, but also when it comes to trust in the media. Show me the data. A bar chart shows that the percentage of Republicans trusting mass media has gone down from just over 40% in the year 2000 to about 10% in 2020. In 2000, Republicans distrusted the media only slightly more than Democrats and independents did. In 2020, independents trusted the media about 3 times as much as Republicans did, and Democrats trusted the media about 7 times as much as Republicans did. Figure 12. 16 Republicans' trust in the media decreased significantly between 2000 and 2020. Souse, Gallup, Attribution, Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC by 4. 0 license. When looking at a more detailed breakdown of who doesn't trust the media, the polling website 538 notes that Republicans in the United States have built on their long-held belief that the media has a liberal bias to incorporate an anti-media stance into their overall ideology. 141. In 2018, 9 in 10 Republicans said they had personally lost trust in the news media in recent years. 142. As people's choices in media content have increased, it is not surprising that both Republicans and Democrats have sought out news sources that reinforce their political beliefs, and the internet has made this especially easy. Additionally, conservatives are more likely to surround themselves with like-minded views online, while liberals are more likely to block friends who do not agree with them on social media. 143. This self-imposed exposure to partisan media ultimately reduces people's overall trust in the mainstream press, regardless of party. 144. Why should we care about trust in the media, and how can we increase it? An informed citizenry is a precondition for democracy, and in order for citizens to act collectively and cast votes in their best interests, people should be able to rely on the media as a source of unbiased information. Without a foundation of trust in the media, people will find their information elsewhere. While one cannot assume that all voters will make an effort to make educated choices, the ability to develop informed decisions makes trust in the media a crucial first step. As former United States Congressman Lee H. Hamilton writes, "The truth is that for our democracy to work, it needs not just an engaged citizenry, but an informed one." 145. The public's habits and their trust have moved in lockstep with one another. And as people have walled themselves off from news they do not believe in, their trust in institutional media has fallen, as has their ability to remain informed. The decline of trust in both governmental and media institutions has real consequences. The erosion of trust in public institutions damages the credibility of those institutions, further undermining their effectiveness and perpetuating a vicious circle. 146. What can be done to restore trust in the media as an institution? Organizations in the United States and around the world have proposed numerous strategies for supporting media institutions and promoting trust. The Knight Foundation points out that a majority of respondents in a 2020 survey believed that it is possible to raise levels of trust in the media. And in pursuit of that goal, the foundation makes 2 substantial suggestions for the media. Official corrections, that is, admitting to errors and publicly correcting them, and increased representation. 147 respondents indicated that when the media issues official corrections, this increases rather than decreases trust, suggesting that transparency is key to raising trust levels. With regard to representation, readers appear to want more representation in newsrooms, with journalists who look like them and more closely reflect their communities. NPR's public editor suggests that the lack of trust also stems from content quality. Cable networks prioritize talking heads 148 over reporting. Print media conflated opinion, analysis, and straight reporting. 149 in response to this, the Trust Project, which partners with 200 news outlets across 12 countries, works with media organizations to incorporate what it calls the 8 trust indicators, 150 in order to facilitate improved news quality and increase reader trust. 151, addressing the issue of media concentration, may also encourage higher quality content and promote a closer relationship with readers and viewers, thus contributing to engendering trust. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, the world's largest intergovernmental organization dedicated to security, elections, human rights, and press freedom, among other concerns, makes a number of recommendations for improving both content quality and people's trust in the media. The OSCE advises European governments to tackle the problem of media concentration by reducing certain taxes for newspaper companies, develop guidelines for editorial independence from corporate owners, strengthen intellectual property and bargaining rights for journalists, and provide sufficient salaries for journalists. Further, the OSCE encourages nations to monitor these recommendations. 152 in the United States, the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, could reverse rules that loosened restrictions on mergers, though as some point out, this would not necessarily prevent smaller media outlets from dying off. One novel suggestion is to require a transaction fee for each merger, with the proceeds going to fund local journalism, especially because it appears that trust is fostered when readers feel that the media outlets they use are tied to their communities. 153. Where can I engage? Help stop the spread of misinformation. To combat misinformation online, organizations such as First Draft work globally with journalists to root out misinformation and provide reporters with resources and information to create the most informed content possible and build trust with audiences. 154. The website hosts a free library of training content, including online courses, toolkits, and resources designed to help both journalists and the public build expertise and stay ahead of misinformation. Everyone has the ability to stop misinformation, and by educating yourself on how to stay alert to the spread of false news, you help promote a healthier media.